Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Martine, and if you are new here, I do videos of Vedic astrology mainly, but also with some tropical insights. And I focus on both relationship and natal astrology. And if you like this video and you would like to hear more content from me, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And also, if you're interested in a personal consultation, I do consultations on a wide variety of topics. Please check out the video description. I will leave my contact information there. Thank you. So today's video is going to be in continuation with the Arudha Lagna theme, but it's not going to be, I haven't forgotten that I still have to do Arudha Lagna in Aquarius and Pisces. I haven't forgotten, but please bear with me because, I don't know, I just had a sudden inspiration to talk about this other topic, which I think is equally interesting, if not even more interesting, and more of a general, presenting a more general interest to a lot of people rather than just for those who have Arudha Lagna in Aquarius or Pisces. And this is namely talking about the second house from the Arudha Lagna and the 8th house from the Arudha Lagna and the role that they have with regards to your image in the world, the way you are perceived, and potential pitfalls and potential benefits that you could have from the second from the Arudha Lagna and from the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, depending on what your particular situation is. So I'm going to talk a little bit in general and why I got, actually it only dawned on me why I got the idea to make this video. Well, it only dawned on me relatively recently that, well, yours truly over here, I happen to have some malefic influence on the 2nd and 8th house from the Arudha Lagna, and it has certainly, I can see now looking back that it has certainly played out in a negative way at times in my life, particularly when it was activated by negative transits, malefic planetary transits like Saturn transits or Mars transits through these houses, because transits towards the Arudha Lagna manifest, I mean, you can read them in a similar fashion to the way you read transits with regards to the D1 chart or the Lagna chart. Basically, transits through particular signs in the Arudha Lagna will activate those signs and those houses. And depending on what these houses are, what they stand for, they're going to have different results. And subsequently, they will have a different impact on your reputation, on your image in the world. They could also potentially be linked to opportunities that you might have, for instance, in the workplace, etc. Because remember that the Arudha Lagna has to do with the illusion that a person casts in the Maya, or the material world. Basically, Arudha Lagna is an image. It's like a hologram of who you really are, okay? But actually, it's not even a hologram, because a hologram basically looks like you, but the Arudha Lagna is a projection. You know, it's kind of like a distorted projection of who you really are. And it's the way that other people perceive you, and it's the way that other people will react to you based on your appearance, basically, and based on your presence in the material world. Remember, and also if you want to see a more in-depth, hear a more in-depth analysis on the subject, I do suggest that you watch the related video that I made about Arudha Lagna versus Karakamsha Lagna and how they play out. And I also remind you that Karakamsha Lagna basically shows your true nature, especially the 3rd house from the Karakamsha will show, and the 9th from the Karakamsha, because, well, anything that sits in the 3rd from the Karakamsha is also going to aspect the 9th. But basically, people having, for instance, malefics in the 3rd from the Karakamsha are people who are seen as, you know, fierce down to the bone, you know, so they're like inherently, their soul is tough and malefic. Obviously, depending on the planet in question, there will be different results. But the Karakamsha is not visible to the rest of the world. The Arudha Lagna is, on the other hand. And for instance, a person, like I mentioned in that video, could have malefics in the 3rd house from the Karakamsha, or the 2nd house from the Karakamsha, and they will be perceived to be very tough and fierce, and they might even be perceived in a negative way, but that might not have any tangency to who they really are deep inside. And conversely, a person could have benefics in the 3rd from the Arudha Lagna. People will see them as a saint, but if they have malefics in the 3rd from the Karakamsha, you can see that deep down they're actually a pretty ruthless person. And so this is why I think that this subject is really interesting to look at. And you can especially see this with public figures and especially politicians when you look at the Karakamsha versus the Arudha, that the image, often is totally the opposite of who the person is deep down inside. But I digress, okay? So this was just kind of an introduction to remind you about what Arudha Lagna is and what the Karakamsha is. And why I wanted to, the reason I wanted to focus on the 2nd and the 8th house. See, the 2nd house has to do with the way people perceive your speech. As well, probably those of you who have watched my videos on all the Arudha Lagnas through signs, I mentioned in each of these how, depending on the sign that sits on the 2nd house from the Arudha Lagna, your speech will be perceived in a different way. But what is really important is planets sitting in the 2nd house from the Arudha Lagna and planets aspecting the 2nd house from the Arudha Lagna. So people who have malefics in the 2nd from the Arudha, I think actually someone asked me this like a while ago, or maybe, I don't know, so offline I was asked this, I don't remember exactly. But they asked me, like, does a person who have malefics in the 2nd from the Arudha, is this a person who's a liar? And I was like, no, absolutely not. You cannot look at malefics from the Arudha, from the 2nd house from the Arudha, and conclude that this person is a liar. Unless they also have, like I said, malefics, especially Saturn or Rahu, in the 3rd from the Karakamsha, then you might think, or if they have it somewhere else in the D1 chart, certain configurations that will tend to show that they like to, make up stories or to deceive people, then you might say, okay, maybe this person is a liar. But otherwise, if the D1 chart and the Karakamsha don't really show that this person is deceptive, the Arudha Lagna simply shows that people will tend to think that this person is dishonest, but it may or may not have any basis in reality. You have to look at the other things. But the problem is, like, when you have malefics in the 2nd, and I say this especially to people who have malefics in the 2nd, especially if you have Saturn or Rahu, and they're sitting in the 2nd house by themselves, they don't have, especially if you don't also have benefic planets aspecting the 2nd, so Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, especially the moon also. If you don't have benefics and you only have Saturn or Rahu sitting in the 2nd, basically people will tend to see you as a deceptive person. So, and it's not even necessarily that you're going to be seen as a liar, but you have to be very careful about everything that you say. And I don't want to, like, depress people by saying this, and I'm not trying to say, hey, you have to censor yourself all the time, but you have to be really careful. Chances are very high that if you have malefics in the 2nd from the Arudha, you could literally be in that scenario where anything you say can be used against you. People will tend to, for instance, especially since malefic in the 2nd are also aspecting the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, and the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, although I haven't mentioned this in the previous videos that I made, so the 8th house from the Arudha Lagna does show a bunch of things. So it shows how people will perceive your health, how people will perceive your ability to pay off your debts, and how financially savvy you are. But another thing that it shows is what is the likelihood that people will gossip about you? So again, if you have malefics influencing the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, you could very easily become a target for all kinds of, defamation. What do you call them? Defamation? I don't know. Like basically a lot of gossip, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of people making up stories about you. Basically you could be a prime target for, cancel culture, basically, because people can try to take things that you've said out of context and basically try to use them against you, especially when there are also transits that activate these houses in a negative way. So if you have Saturn transiting through the 2nd or the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, or if you have Mars transiting or Rahu through the 2nd or the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, this would be especially true. And, this is something that I wanted to say. And another thing that could happen is not necessarily that these people are seen as another thing that could happen, so because if you have malefics in the 2nd, is that even if you say a lie, no matter how small it is, like let me give you an example. So let's say you don't want to participate in the office team meeting, and you come up with an excuse like I have to go to the doctor or whatever. And let's say by some twist of fate, someone finds out that you were not actually at the doctor during that time. It is more likely in your case that this could turn into some kind of a scandal. Like the person maybe that saw this will try to use this against you, maybe will talk to your boss, will call you a liar. So these kinds of things can really damage your reputation a lot more than for a person who doesn't have any malefics aspecting the 2nd from the Arudha Lagna, or people who have mostly benefics. So for instance, a person who has mostly benefics in the 2nd from the Arudha, they could be lying all day, all night, and people will never really catch on to it, because they will, especially if someone has Jupiter in the 2nd from the Arudha, people will always think, oh, this person sounds like such a wise, justice-loving individual. I'm sure that they would never lie about anything. And this is how, again, you can see this in public figures, politicians, blah, blah, blah. A lot of them, they don't have malefics, or they mostly have benefics. The ones that make it to the top usually, they don't, usually, of course, there are different methods to make it in politics. You can also become a controversial figure, and that will help boost your career in politics. But generally, if people have nothing but benefics in the 2nd from the Arudha, they're going to be seen in a more positive light when it comes to the degree of trustworthiness of their words, and the way that they're perceived when they communicate, basically. So that's one. And the reason I mentioned this is like yours truly over here, I happen to have some malefics on the 2nd and the 8th. And if any of you have watched the rant where I talked about the experience going through harassment at work a few years ago, actually last year, basically, I realized afterwards that I was so there was Saturn transiting through my 2nd from the Arudha Lagna around that time, and exactly everything that I'm talking to you about right now happened to me. There were a bunch of people who, started gossiping, making up stories about me in the office, and basically started putting pressure on management to try to, get rid of me or get me fired or whatever. And this person in question that I made an accusation about, lo and behold, he did not have the same, trashing of his Arudha Lagna. And the reason I know this is because he gave me his, time of birth and date of birth and everything before we had a fallout. Anyway, I digress. And I'm not just basing this on my own experience. I've seen it actually, and now that I know about it, I've actually seen it in a bunch of people that I know, and I also can think about other instances in my own life where this thing has happened, So especially if you have malefics in the 8th from the Arudha, you could have a lot of naysayers and backstabbers and a lot of people who make up stories about you to try to affect your reputation in a negative way. You know, because the motivation could be anything, you know, competition, jealousy, whatever. But basically, and now some of you might be thinking, okay, but so I have malefics in the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, or in the 8th from the Arudha Lagna, and what can I do about it? Like, okay, so people are gonna gossip about me, what can I do about it? Well, one of the things that you can do about it is to make sure that you don't give them much to gossip about, you know, and that's another thing that I wish I would have understood some years ago, because so you have to think about, basically you have to be way more careful at how the things you are saying can be used against you. You always have to remember that. So for instance, like I mentioned with this cancel culture thing, so like you could, you know, there have been countless of cases of people who I don't know, said something in a certain context, people took it out of context and tried to blame them for whatever, various nonsense that had nothing to do with them. And, you know, if you have malefics in the 2nd or the 8th from the Arudha, this is actually more likely to happen to you than it is to an average person, or a person who has only benefics in these houses. And again, like I mentioned, another thing that can happen, so let me give you an example. If you have a malefic in the 2nd from the Arudha, it could be like, let's say for instance you had a public argument or a public fallout with, I don't know, an acquaintance 3 years ago. Someone knows about it, and now this person, let's say, turns out murdered, and before you know it, the police are at your door asking you questions. You know, like someone testified that you had a fallout with this person 3 years ago. And, you know, so this sounds like a really far-fetched thing, but this literally could happen. It could get to that point where people try to scapegoat you, basically. That's what's going to happen if you have malefics. And again, especially you have to especially pay attention to bad negative transits of malefics through the 2nd or the 8th from the Arudha. And yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. And if you have benefics, then you are one of the lucky ones, because people will tend to trust what you have to say. You are going to be really convincing, especially if you have Jupiter, and you also come across as a healthy person if you have benefics aspecting the 8th house from the Arudha Lagna. I have looked at a few charts just for fun. And one of them is Joe Biden, who has his Lagna in Scorpio and Ketu in the fourth house in Aquarius, which means he has one. So because he has Ascendant in Scorpio, he has 2 Arudha Lagnas. I mentioned this in the videos that I made about how to calculate Arudha Lagna. So he has 1 Arudha Lagna in Taurus. Gemini rules the 2nd of the Arudha Lagna, so there's no malefic there, right, because it's ruled by Mercury. And you also have Jupiter in the 3rd from the Arudha Lagna in Cancer, which, like I said, benefics in the 3rd from the Arudha Lagna makes people trust your intentions. So people will tend to see you as wise and benevolent when it comes to going for what you want. And another Arudha Lagna, the 2nd Arudha Lagna, is in Virgo. He has Mars, Mercury conjunct in Libra in the 2nd from the Arudha Lagna. Which shows, again, Mars there is a malefic, but it is conjunct Mercury and it's in Libra. So that's the sign of diplomacy. So this could simply mean that this person is seen as assertive in speech, but still diplomatic. And he also has Venus conjunct Sun in the 3rd from the Arudha Lagna. So overall, I would say Sun is kind of like halfway between a malefic and a benefic. But it's more of a benefic, really, in the grand scheme of things. And Venus conjunct Sun in the 3rd from the Arudha. So he has 2 Arudha Lagnas, right? One of them has no planets in the 2nd house from the Arudha. The other has Mars, Mercury conjunct in Libra in the 2nd from the Arudha Lagna. Overall, not a very malefic presence. And a benefic is present in the third from the Arudha in each case. Jupiter in the third from Arudha in Cancer, and Venus in the third from Arudha for his Virgo Arudha Lagna. So basically comes across as a pretty benign person. In his Karakamsha, however, he has Rahu in the third house from the Karakamsha Lagna. Now, obviously, I'm not going to claim to be a mind reader. I don't know what the guy thinks, but Rahu is a very deceptive planet. Okay, so at the very least, I would say this is a person who is definitely no stranger to manipulation. Rahu especially, I would say, is, remember that Rahu is about the illusion of the Maya, so it's all about smoke and mirrors. And it's a planet that will stop at nothing to get what it wants, basically. And the third from the Karakamsha shows the inner nature, unlike the Arudha Lagna, which is the surface of a person. Another thing is that he has Mars, Mercury conjunct in the fifth from the Karakamsha. The fifth house from the Karakamsha shows talents that you have inherited through previous reincarnations. So Mars, Mercury conjunct in the fifth from the Karakamsha shows a talent for debates, communication, and assertiveness, which are the talents that he is going to use to get what he wants in this life. And conversely, I looked at, Donald Trump, which neither of them actually is great, but Donald Trump very clearly has a malefic presence because, is perceived in a very negative way because he has Ascendant in Leo, Sun in the 10th house, his Arudha falls in Aquarius, and the second house ruler is Jupiter. It's aspected by Rahu and Saturn. So Donald Trump comes across as a liar. Basically. He comes across as a person who is manipulative. Why? Because, there are no planets in his second house from the Arudha Lagna. There is a benefic ruling the second from the Arudha, because it's Pisces and it's ruled by Jupiter. However, Jupiter is aspected by Rahu and Saturn, which are both malefics, and they both are connected to deception. And on top of that, he has Ketu, obviously, if Rahu is aspecting, then Ketu is aspecting the second from the Arudha as well. The third from the Arudha Lagna is empty, but it's ruled by Mars, which is a malefic, which shows that this person comes across as a pretty aggressive individual. And on top of that, the thing that really seals it for him in terms of being a polarizing individual is the fact that he has Mars in the 7th house from the Arudha Lagna, which is very likely to make an individual very polarizing, to say the least, because again, this is something that just solidifies a person's image as being really aggressive, kind of selfish as well, because Mars is kind of a it's kind of a warlike sort of energy, so it's definitely not a great placement for someone that you would expect to be diplomatic or in diplomatic situations. Another famous example of someone who has Mars in the 7th from the Arudha conjunct Saturn in the 7th from the Arudha is Teal Swan. And the reason I mention her, by the way, I don't want you to think that I'm some kind of a diehard fan, but I have watched a lot of her videos, and I do think for the most part she actually makes a lot of sense. And she had one video up in particular that I've seen a while ago, where she was talking about the amount of opposition that she has to go through with, people actively trying to destroy her image and, attacking her family and all this stuff. And it's no surprise, again, because I think she's also a very polarizing person. And it wasn't a surprise to me at all when I checked her Arudha Lagna. She also has Mars conjunct Saturn in the 7th house from the Arudha Lagna. And yeah, so again, it's the kind of planets in the 7th from the Arudha shows people that will oppose you directly and openly. So Mars is a very strong planet, so it does show strong enemies, persistent enemies, aggressive enemies. It shows that, it could also show that men are opposing you, or the military or military forces are opposing you. But in any case, people who have Mars in the 7th or the 1st or the 3rd from the Arudha, they come across as really warlike and selfish. And so people will tend to not trust them, especially when it comes to positions of diplomacy and stuff like that. But again, Arudha is the surface image. And when it comes to Trump's chart, in her 3rd from the Karakamsha, he has Sun conjunct Rahu, so he's no angel either. However, with Sun in the 3rd from the Karakamsha, I would say that there's some principle there, because the Sun doesn't like BS. Like, Sun to me is like, really, Sun is really the most principled planet out there. So these are people who don't like to lie. And obviously, I think when you're talking about a field like politics, you probably have no chance of making it unless you use some form of deception or manipulation in this. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm too cynical, but that's the way that I see it. But overall, I would say his Karakamsha situation is a little bit, a little bit rosier, but it's still not great because you still have Rahu there. So at the very least, this can definitely explain why he has a tendency to exaggerate things and, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, and the overblown ego and stuff. Some other examples that I looked at are actresses and actors. So, for instance, Vivian Lee has had Venus in the 2nd house from the Arudha Lagna in Virgo, no other planet there. So obviously this is great for an actress, especially a female actress, because when she speaks it's very pleasant, it's very charming, very feminine. Venus in the 2nd from it's kind of like, it's very charming and sweet, and it's definitely, being a benefic, shows that it will, your voice will aid your reputation and your image in the world. Nicole Kidman, another example, 2nd house from the Arudha Lagna in Taurus, empty, but ruled by Venus. So again, similar to Vivian Lee's situation, this is, a person who is perceived as really diplomatic and sweet and charming when she speaks, and very feminine. Another example, Tom Cruise with Mars, Mercury conjunct in Taurus in the 2nd from the Arudha Lagna. Again, I think it matches him. Mars is not a planet that makes a person come across like someone who is deceptive, because it's too blunt and too direct. But it's on the other end of the spectrum. It makes a person come across as coarse, sarcastic, almost someone like barks when they speak with someone or when they attack someone. They can come across as very aggressive in speech, and I think that definitely shows in Tom Cruise's case, because not just when he speaks as a person, but a lot of the roles that he had in movies were roles where, like Men of Honor, where he was like yelling, and a lot of, even in Jerry Maguire, in The Firm, like a lot of the movies that I've seen him, even as Lestat, right, he was very sarcastic and kind of cruel when he was talking. So I think it really shows and Mercury being there just makes a person precise with their speech and their wording. So this is a person who is cutthroat. They have a surgical precision when it comes to when it comes to attacking someone in speech. So I think it matches him, and he also played lawyers, I think, more than once, or maybe just once, I don't know. And it's definitely Mars in the 2nd from the Arudha would definitely aid the image of a lawyer, because they have to be really assertive when they speak. Evan Rachel Wood has two Arudha Lagnas, Taurus and Cancer. Her ascendant is in Scorpio. That's why she has two Arudha Lagnas. One of them has a 2nd house empty. The other one has Venus, Sun, and Mars conjunct in the 2nd from the Arudha Lagna. Again, I think in her case it also shows, because she also played a lot of roles that kind of, pardon my French, made her look bitchy. Like, she played a lot of roles that, portrayed her as this really kind of stubborn, headstrong, maybe not necessarily aggressive in speech, but yeah, also aggressive in speech, I guess. But basically, yeah, I think it matches her persona. And also having Sun there, so having Venus there also makes her pleasant, but having Mars there also makes her aggressive and assertive in speech. And the Sun gives authority. Like, people who have Sun in the second, you know, they're this kind of people who, when they speak, everybody tends to just shut up automatically, because it's like, you know, like, shut up, the king is speaking or the queen is speaking. So they have this really authoritarian way of speaking, of expressing themselves. And Tony Robbins, unsurprising, has, so first of all, he has Ascendant in Virgo, Mercury in the 7th house in Pisces. His Arudha Lagna, therefore, is in Sagittarius. He has Jupiter conjunct Saturn in Sagittarius, so in the actual Arudha Lagna, which, well, definitely fits a person who is addressing to large audiences. It's kind of like a spiritual teacher, because Jupiter rules spirituality and higher teachings. Jupiter conjunct Saturn in Sagittarius. Mars conjunct Venus in Capricorn. Again, he has Mars and Venus in Capricorn. So Mars is exalted in Capricorn. It's a very strong Mars in the second from the Arudha Lagna. So, unsurprising. He is also a very aggressive speaker. If you've seen some of his, you know, what do you even call them? Lectures, I guess, or shows or whatever. He is a very passionate, aggressive speaker, and but he also kind of manages to still be a little bit diplomatic. He's not like, you know, he's not crude, let's say. That's, you know, perfectly illustrated by the fact that he has Mars conjunct Venus in Capricorn. And also Capricorn, funny enough, makes a person quite traditionalist. I think I have picked up on some things that kind of match him. But okay, or at least match his image. I think he comes across as a traditionalist. Anyway, another example is Sadhguru, Ascendant in Taurus, Venus in the 5th in Virgo, Arudha Lagna therefore in Capricorn. Second house from Arudha Lagna is in Aquarius. It's empty, but it is opposite Sun, Mars, Mercury in Leo. Again, you see this person speaks with authority because he has Sun aspecting the second from the Arudha. And first of all, so the opposite bunch of planets are falling in his 8th house from the Arudha Lagna, which also shows that, well, for the most part, he's seen as a pretty robust, healthy person. For the most part. Okay, so Sun opposite the second house makes him speak with authority. Mars means that he speaks with aggression, or like, well, not aggression in his case, but let's say assertiveness. And Mercury again shows precision of language. Especially Sun here is pretty strong because it's in its own sign in Leo. So this is definitely like the strongest energy here is that of the Sun, which is an authoritative speaker. Ruler of the second house from Arudha Lagna in Sagittarius, and Rahu, so the ruler of the second house, so although the second house itself is empty, the ruler of the second house is in Sagittarius, which is, again, it's the sign that is connected to higher learning, religion, spirituality. He is a spiritual teacher. And then Rahu, the co-ruler, is in Libra, which is diplomacy, negotiations, one-on-one situations. So overall, these are just some examples of how I've seen, you know, the second and 8th house from the Arudha Lagna affect a person's image in the world. And also their professional lives. Like I have mentioned several times in the videos that I made about each individual Arudha Lagna, because, yeah, there's a lot of influence on, you know, your career and your role in society, of course, when that comes from the Arudha Lagna and the way that other people see you. So this has been it, and this is what I wanted to say. The video has dragged on again, but once again, thank you for watching until the end, if you have watched until the end, and if you like it, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And if you're interested in a personal consultation, I do consultations on a wide variety of topics. Please check out the video description. I will leave my contact information there. Thank you.